Imagine it's the spring of 1944. For nearly 5 long years, Britain has been at war. A nation stretched to its absolute limit. The days are long, the nights are dark, and the future is uncertain. But then, something begins to happen along the coastlines. Something so immense, so startling, it feels like a scene from another world. This is the story of the Great American Armada. The moment the full might of an industrial giant arrived on Britain's doorstep, and the tide of World War II began to turn for good. From the historic naval base at Portsmouth to the bustling docks of Plymouth, from the sprawling port of Southampton all the way to the Thames estuary, a change was taking place. Harbors that had been relatively quiet, even eerily empty at times, were suddenly, inexplicably, overflowing. It started as a trickle, then became a flood. Ship after ship, flying the stars and stripes, appeared on the horizon, a seemingly endless procession steaming in from the Atlantic. This wasn't just a handful of vessels. It was an armada of a scale the world had never witnessed before. British naval officers, men who had stared down the German war machine since 1939, were left utterly speechless. They had fought in the Battle of the Atlantic. They had seen Dunkirk. They had endured the Blitz. They were hardened veterans who thought they had seen it all. But this was different. They had, of course, expected American support. The Lend-Lease Act had been a lifeline, and American troops had been arriving for months. But no one, not even in their wildest projections, had anticipated the sheer, overwhelming scale of what was now unfolding before their eyes. Picture the scene. Mighty battleships, their colossal gray hulls dominating the skyline, anchored alongside sleek, fast cruisers and nimble destroyers. Beyond them, an ocean of troop transports, each one packed with thousands of young American soldiers ready to join the fight. And then there were the landing craft, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of them. Higgins boats, Estes landing ship, tank sand, countless other specialized vessels, all designed for one specific, terrifying purpose: to storm a hostile shore. They were packed so tightly in the harbors and estuaries that it was said you could almost walk from one side to the other without getting your feet wet. This wasn't just a naval force, it was a floating city, a mobile nation. The quantity of materiel was simply mind-boggling. Ship after ship opened its cavernous holds and outpoured a torrent of the tools of war. Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks rolled down the ramps in an endless stream. Sherman tanks, their engines rumbling with pent-up power, were carefully craned onto the docks. And the supplies, mountains of them. Crates of ammunition stacked as high as houses, barrels of fuel, millions of gallons of it, essential for a mechanized army. Boxers of rations, medical supplies, uniforms, boots, everything a modern army of millions would need to invade a continent and win a war. The logistical challenge was monumental. British quartermasters, who were masters of making do with limited resources, were suddenly faced with the opposite problem. They were drowning in abundance. They scrambled to find space to store it all. Warehouses filled up overnight. Open fields, parks, and country estates were requisitioned, transforming the gentle English countryside into a massive, sprawling military depot. Every quiet country lane, it seemed, was now rumbling with the traffic of American trucks. Every village green a temporary parking lot for tanks and artillery. For the British civilians who witnessed this, it was a spectacle of hope and awe. After years of rationing, blackout, and the constant threat of attack, this visible, tangible proof of America's commitment was a profound morale boost. They saw the GIs, young men from places they'd only heard of in movies: Ohio, Texas, California, filling their towns, and Biaches, bringing with them a different energy, a sense of optimism and raw power. This wasn't just an alliance on paper anymore. It was real, it was loud, and it was right outside their windows. This was the moment when the abstract concept of America as the arsenal of democracy, a phrase coined by President Roosevelt, became a physical reality. It was no longer just about factories churning out planes and ships thousands of miles away. The products of that arsenal were now here, assembled and ready for action. Britain had provided the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the forward base, the staging ground. But it was America that was providing the overwhelming mass, the sheer industrial weight that would be needed to smash through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The arrival of this armada sent a clear and unmistakable message, not just to the Allies, but to the enemy as well. German intelligence couldn't possibly miss it. The spy planes and reconnaissance reports would have painted a terrifying picture of Britain groaning under the weight of American military power. The secret of the invasion's location was paramount, but the secret of its coming was out. The question was no longer asterisk, if asterisk the Allies would invade, but asterisk when asterisk, and asterisk where asterisk. As the spring of 1944 wore on, the tension and the activity reached a fever pitch. This vast concentration of men and machines was a coiled spring, a force of unprecedented power waiting for the signal to be unleashed. For everyone involved, from the highest-ranking general to the ordinary civilian, one thing was crystal clear. The liberation of Europe was no longer a distant dream. It was an imminent probability. The arrival of the American Armada had made it possible. The Great Crusade was about to begin. Ever wonder how the D-Day invasion was even possible? It wasn't just about soldiers and strategy. It was about something far bigger, a force that reshaped the entire war. American industrial power. Imagine the scene in early 1944. British ports, once bustling, were now a forest of steel masts. So many ships crowded the harbors that you could practically walk from one end to the other without touching the water. Where did all these vessels come from? The answer lay across the Atlantic. While Britain's shipyards were heroically patching up ships battered by years of relentless combat, a miracle was unfolding in the United States. American factories, humming with unprecedented energy, were churning out the tools of liberation. They had vast resources, innovative new methods, and a workforce of millions, all dedicated to a single goal. This wasn't just about building ships. It was about building them at a speed that defied belief. Take the LST, the landing ship, tank. This was the workhorse of the invasion. A floating garage designed to run right up onto a hostile beach and disgorge tanks and troops. It was the key to cracking Hitler's Atlantic Wall. British planners looked at the sheer numbers required and knew they could never build enough in time. Their own shipyards were stretched to the breaking point. But in America, LSDs were flowing off assembly lines in a steady, unstoppable stream. It was a spectacle of production that the Axis powers simply couldn't comprehend, let alone match. And it wasn't just the big ships. The famous Liberty ships, those massive cargo haulers, were being constructed in weeks, sometimes even in a matter of days. Think about that. A 10,000-ton ocean-going vessel, built from scratch in the time it takes to watch a few movies. This incredible feat was made possible by prefabrication and assembly line techniques, perfected in the automotive industry and now applied to shipbuilding with breathtaking results. Then you have the smaller, specialized landing craft, the unsung heroes of D-Day, the LCVP, or Higgins boat, which carried squads of infantry right into the line of fire. The LCT, the landing craft, tank, for smaller armored vehicles. And the LCI, the landing craft, infantry, which could deliver hundreds of men at a time. These weren't built in traditional, massive naval shipyards. They were mass-produced in civilian boatyards all across America, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Places that before the war might have built fishing boats or pleasure yachts were now essential cogs in the war machine. The speed was so staggering that when the initial production reports reached London, many British officers thought they were mistakes, typographical errors, propaganda. Even the numbers just seemed impossible. A ship a day, hundreds of landing craft a week. It sounded like pure fantasy, but then they looked out their windows at the harbors of Portsmouth, Southampton, and Plymouth, and they saw the proof floating right before their eyes. The harbors were filling up, day by day, with American-built steel. This relentless wave of ships was the ultimate weapon. German U-boats, the wolves of the Atlantic, had been devastating Allied shipping for years. But now, American factories were producing ships faster than the Germans could ever hope to sink them. For every vessel lost, 2, 3, or even 4 more were launched to take its place. It was a war of attrition that Germany was destined to lose, a battle of factory versus factory. Let's put it into perspective. By the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord had amassed a fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels of all types. A huge portion of that fleet, especially the critical landing ships and craft, owed its existence to American shipyards. This industrial tidal wave was the foundation upon which the entire invasion was built. It carried the men, the tanks, the jeeps, the ammunition, and the supplies that would break the back of the Nazi regime in Western Europe. British officers, watching the tangible evidence of this industrial might arrive daily, understood the profound truth. There could be no DD without this fleet. There could be no invasion force without the ships to carry it. And there could be no liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands without the astonishing productivity of American factories. It was a partnership, to be sure, forged in the fires of war. British courage, Canadian resolve, and the spirit of all the Allied nations were indispensable. But the engine that powered the whole endeavor, the industrial heart that pumped lifeblood into the invasion, was unequivocally American. The road to victory wasn't just paved with bravery. It was built, plate by plate, rivet by rivet, in the shipyards of a nation that had truly become the arsenal of democracy. For centuries, the British Royal Navy had been the undisputed master of the seas. Its admirals, raised in the long shadow of Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, believed that Britannia truly ruled the waves. The early years of World War II, however, had stretched this legendary force to its absolute breaking point. Imagine being an admiral in the British High Command during this time. Your world is one of constant, gnawing scarcity. You're desperately scraping together every available destroyer, every corvette, to protect the vital convoys that are the United Kingdom's lifeline. You're fighting a brutal, attritional war in the Atlantic against German U-boats, patrolling vast, unforgiving oceans, and defending the homeland from the ever-present threat of invasion. Every ship lost is a catastrophic blow. Every decision is weighed against the razor-thin margins of survival. It's a daily grind of improvisation, patching up damaged vessels, and sending men and ships back into the fray, knowing you simply don't have enough of anything. The entire war effort hangs by a thread, and you are the one holding the scissors, praying the thread doesn't snap. Then America enters the war, and what happens next is something that no one in the British Admiralty could have ever truly comprehended. It wasn't a trickle of aid. It was a flood, a tsunami of industrial might that crashed upon British shores. Suddenly, the ports of Liverpool, Glasgow, and Southampton are choked with ships, not just a few dozen, but hundreds, then thousands. Massive escort carriers, sleek, new destroyers, and an almost unbelievable number of landing craft. Famous Higgins boats arrive, in staggering quantities. It's an armada that appears almost out of thin air. One British officer, accustomed to making do with a handful of vessels, would look out at a harbor and see more ships than he had commanded in his entire career, all gathered for a single operation. The sheer scale was mind-boggling. It wasn't just the ships, it was everything that came with them. Millions of tons of supplies, from ammunition and fuel to food and medical equipment, flowed into Britain with what seemed like casual, almost effortless ease. For the British admirals who had spent years fighting for their nation's survival, this was a moment of profound shock. These were men who had watched their proud fleet get whittled down at Dunkirk, in the Mediterranean, and in the frozen waters of the North Atlantic. They knew the cost of war in blood and steel. Now, they were witnessing a display of power that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. The United States didn't just bring a few ships to the party, it brought an entire ocean's worth. The American naval escort force alone was larger and more powerful than anything the German Kriegsmarine could ever hope to assemble. This wasn't just reinforcing an ally. This was a fundamental, overnight transformation of the entire strategic balance of power. In their private letters and secret memos, the language used by these stoic, hardened British commanders was one of utter astonishment. They called it a miracle of modern industrial war. They described the seemingly endless columns of American ships and men as a sight that defied all previous experience. The psychological impact was just as significant as the material one. For years, victory had been a distant, uncertain hope. The British had fought with courage and tenacity, but they were fighting a defensive war, A war of attrition they were not guaranteed to win. The arrival of the American Armada changed everything. Hope was no longer a flicker in the dark. It was a blazing sunrise on the horizon. Victory was no longer a distant possibility to be prayed for. It became an approaching, mathematical certainty. It was the moment they knew, with absolute conviction, that the tide had turned for good. The Royal Navy would still play a crucial role, of course. Their experience, their leadership in naval combat, and their powerful capital ships, like the battleships King George V and Duke of York, were indispensable. British sailors knew the English Channel and the North Sea like the back of their hands. Their expertise in minesweeping, coastal defense, and anti-submarine warfare was hard-won and invaluable. It was a partnership. The Royal Navy provided the seasoned experience and crucial leadership, but it was the unstoppable momentum of American production that provided the overwhelming mass. This incredible buildup wasn't just about numbers. It was about a new philosophy of war. The American approach was one of abundance. If a problem arose, the solution was to throw resources at it, until the problem was crushed. Need to cross the channel? Don't just build a few hundred landing craft. Build thousands upon thousands. Worried about U-boats? Don't just rely on a few destroyer patrols. Create entire hunter-killer groups centered around new escort carriers, flooding the Atlantic with aircraft and ships. This concept of overwhelming force, backed by a continent-sized industrial base operating far beyond the reach of enemy bombers, was a game. The British, with their island economy under constant threat, could never have dreamed of waging war on such a scale. Seeing it unfold before their eyes was both humbling and exhilarating. It was the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt had promised, and for the commanders of the Royal Navy, who had held the line for so long, it was the ultimate validation of their sacrifice. They had held on long enough for the new world to arrive, with all its power and might, to ensure the liberation of the old. That sight of the American fleet, gathering in British waters, was more than just a military buildup. It was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. It was the moment the dream of victory became an unstoppable reality. Have you ever wondered what really made D-Day possible? We all know the stories of bravery on the beaches of Normandy, the daring paratroopers, and the brilliant military strategies. But what if I told you the war was won long before the first soldier set foot on French soil? The real secret weapon, the force that guaranteed the success of Operation Overlord, wasn't a general or a new type of tank. It was something much, much bigger. It was the sheer, unstoppable power of American industry. By early June 1944, as the final plans were being locked in, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle of factories. And in that arena, there was no contest. The sheer volume of materials needed to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history was staggering. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of ships, landing craft, tanks, trucks, jeeps, and planes. We're talking about mountains of ammunition, endless barrels of fuel, and enough food and supplies to sustain an entire army on a hostile continent. Think about it this way. For every ship the Allies might lose crossing the English Channel, America could build 10 more to replace it. For every tank knocked out in a firefight, a dozen more were already rolling off assembly lines back home. Germany, on the other hand, was stretched to its absolute limit. Their war machine was sputtering. They could barely replace their losses, let alone match the tidal wave of equipment and supplies that the Allies were bringing to the fight. This industrial tsunami, as some have called it, completely overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. They simply couldn't keep up. They couldn't move their troops. They couldn't replenish their supplies. They were fighting a war of attrition against an opponent that had, for all intents and purposes, infinite resources, while British ingenuity was absolutely crucial in shaping the strategy. And the courage of British and Canadian forces was undeniable. The sheer scale of the operation rested squarely on America's shoulders. The ability to build, transport, and deploy this colossal arsenal was something no other nation on Earth could have achieved at that time. Let's dive into some of the specifics, because the numbers are truly mind-boggling. Take the Liberty ships, for example. These were the workhorses of the Atlantic. They weren't fancy, they weren't fast, but they could be built at an astonishing rate sometimes. In as little as a few weeks, Thousands of them were constructed, forming a constant, unbreakable supply chain of fetus. Across the ocean, this bridge of ships ensured that the troops in Britain were never short of what they needed. Then there were the landing craft, Higgins boats, LSTs, Dukes. These were the vehicles that would actually deliver the soldiers and their equipment onto the beaches. Before the war, the U.S. had very few of these. By D-Day, they had produced them in the tens of thousands. Andrew Jackson Higgins, the man behind the famous Higgins boat, transformed his small boat-building company in New Orleans into a manufacturing giant, churning out the craft that Eisenhower would later say won the war for us. Without these boats, there would have been no amphibious assault. It's as simple as that. And what about air power? The skies over Normandy were dominated by Allied planes. Fleets of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators had been pounding German defenses and infrastructure for months leading up to the invasion. These planes, built in massive factories by a workforce that included millions of women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, crippled Germany's ability to respond to the invasion. They destroyed bridges, railway lines, and communication centers, isolating the Normandy battlefield and preventing German reinforcements from reaching the front lines in time. Let's not forget the fuel. An army runs on its stomach, but a mechanized army runs on gasoline. The logistics of supplying millions of gallons of fuel to the front lines was a monumental challenge. The solution was the pipeline under the ocean, or Pluto. This incredible feat of engineering involved laying flexible pipelines across the English Channel to pump fuel directly to the Allied forces in France. This continuous flow of fuel kept the tanks rolling and the planes flying, allowing the Allies to maintain their momentum after the initial breakout from Normandy. It was a logistical masterstroke, entirely dependent on industrial capacity and innovation. So, when we look back at June 6, 1944, it's important to remember that the outcome wasn't decided in a single day. It was decided in the months and years of tireless work in the shipyards of California, the factories of Detroit, and the oil fields of Texas. It was the logistical planners who meticulously calculated every last bullet and every last can of food. It was the engineers who designed and built the tools of liberation. The American naval buildup in Britain wasn't just preparation. It was the physical embodiment of an industrial power that the Axis could not hope to match. The victory on D-Day was a testament to the bravery of the soldiers who fought and died on those beaches, but it was made possible by the unseen army of workers, engineers, and logisticians back home. They built the arsenal of democracy, and in doing so, they built the foundation for the liberation of Europe. The war in Europe was ultimately a contest of production, and America simply outproduced its enemies on a scale that the world had never seen before and has never seen since.